Hey there, and welcome back to the ForwardCast, the podcast designed to give former Jehovah's Witnesses and other members of high control groups the tools they need to rebuild their lives, rip out the bad mental programming and thought patterns that got shoved into their heads, take back control of their destiny, and become the people they were always supposed to be. So, joining me today on the ForwardCast is a friend of mine and colleague from JW Survey, Lloyd Evans. Just to give you a quick rundown on Lloyd, Lloyd was formerly a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses, but upon leaving, he didn't simply leave and walk away. He decided that he needed to highlight some of the dangerous and toxic practices of the Jehovah's Witness religion, and also campaign to give other former Jehovah's Witnesses and perhaps Jehovah's Witnesses still in the organization the chance to analyze their own beliefs, come to a decision about whether or not they thought it was the true religion, and also to help support people once they'd left. Lloyd is the creator of the JW Survey website, which regularly surveys former and current Jehovah's Witnesses as to their opinions on the organization. He runs a YouTube channel, the John Cedars YouTube channel, which regularly discusses news items relating to Jehovah's Witnesses, Jehovah's Witness teachings and history. And he's the author of two books. The first is entitled The Reluctant Apostate, which is a mix of his own autobiography, chronicling his life in the Jehovah's Witnesses and his journey out of the religion. And it's also a simultaneous analysis of the history of the religion. And he's also got a new book just out, which is entitled How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses, which is kind of a book that's custom designed to help people who've woken up in this religion and realized that it's not the true faith they thought it was. It's a book designed to help them leave in the best possible way. So, Lloyd Evans, thank you for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure, and it's nice to be being on the other end of the mic, so to speak.
We've turned the tables on you today.
We have, yeah. Are you going to introduce the news at any point? That's what I want to know.
I'm thinking about it. I might sort of segue some random news in here just so I can keep the theme going, just so I can keep the theme. So what I was thinking is that if we could quickly start with a quick sort of 5-minute recap of your journey kind of out of the Jehovah's Witnesses, if you could quickly tell us very quickly about what your life was like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, how you woke up, and what it was like to leave.
Okay, so I guess the quick recap would be that I grew up very much a devout believer. I had a tragedy when I was 21 when I lost my mother to cancer, and when you lose someone as a Jehovah's Witness, the response is to draw closer to the organization. So that's exactly what I did. I went to a special school for Jehovah's Witness men. I graduated from that school. I later became an elder. And I took everything very seriously. It was only when I moved to Croatia that I started, within a few months, to realize that I didn't believe. And that was purely because I was disconnected from the constant flow of information, of indoctrination that you receive when you're a witness. When everything's suddenly in a different language, it can be quite a wake up.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you found yourself in that situation where you no longer believed the religion, and you took the decision. I believe you started JW Survey whilst you were still technically a member of the religion, but you were
That's right.
On your way out. That journey out, you started to make it on your own, didn't you? Because at first your wife wasn't aware that you were having these doubts and issues.
She knew I was having the doubts and issues, but obviously she was at a different place when that happened. Because just because I was having doubts, obviously that didn't mean that she was going to have doubts, and it did cause quite a bit of stress in the relationship, because I can always remember one of the things that she said not long after we were married is, she said, the only reason I could ever have to stop loving you would be if you stopped being a Jehovah's Witness. And you know, so knowing that when you do stop believing can be a very, very stressful thing, and you wonder whether, in addition to going through leaving your religion, through walking away from your religion, you're also in effect walking away from your marriage. So all sorts of things start flying through your head. But I tried to be as open as I could be about my doubts from quite an early stage, and I did that actually through writing letters because I was too terrified to kind of verbalize, kind of in a face-to-face conversation, what was going through my mind, because it was so traumatic for me to even talk about it, that I found the solution was to just write, and I think it helped in a way to have it written down, because then it showed that I was serious.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to kind of con or anything. If I was serious enough to put pen to paper, then I really did mean what I was saying.
Yeah. And it's interesting because this situation you find yourself in, this is very common with people who are perhaps Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientologists, or they're in a very fundamentalist religion, a fundamentalist form of Islam, perhaps, who find that they're starting to realize that this religion isn't the religion I thought it was, but they have a family who's also in this religion. They have, for example, a wife or a husband. And then they have this dilemma of, I want to leave this religion, or I need to set myself outside of it because I can't follow this faith anymore. But the potential cost of doing so may, like you say, is this going to cost me my marriage? Is this going to cost me my family? So this is one of the reasons what we're doing on this podcast is asking people who've been through this situation, for them, what worked, what perhaps didn't work as well, what they do again, because you were able to help Deanna come to the realization that the Jehovah's Witnesses were not the true religion. So you were able to do that. What do you think worked well for you, and what in hindsight wouldn't you do again, and what kind of advice would you give to someone who's now in that situation you found yourself in?
I think when it comes to Deanna, I wouldn't have done anything differently. I think without wanting to kind of brag too much, I pretty much did it perfectly. I did things slightly differently with my dad, but then I kind of had different expectations for my dad because he was an elder, or is an elder, and my logic was that if he's a congregation elder and he's therefore a spiritual shepherd and someone who members of the congregation would approach with quite complicated issues, including doubts and questions about their faith, why shouldn't he be able to handle a similar conversation with his son? And when it very quickly became apparent that he couldn't handle that conversation, didn't want to have that conversation, in fact would bravely run away from such a conversation, that kind of led to a great deal of frustration on my part. And I look back with regret that I allowed that frustration to manifest itself in the visceral way that I did. I think I would have done that differently. But as far as my wife's concerned, I was just very, well, first of all, I kind of resigned myself to the fact that it could potentially lead to the end of my marriage. So I think that allowed me to kind of step back a little bit and try to be as pragmatic as possible. But I also just was very anxious not to ambush her with information and make her feel as though she was being manipulated in any way, shape or form. So I didn't actually confront her with information. I would wait for her to come to me with questions. The only exception being if I made a discovery, such as the United Nations NGO scandal, that Watchtower was a member of a non-governmental organization, rather, for the United Nations for 9 years. I went, when you discover that, you can't help but kind of share this revelation with the person you care about. But that she could see in those instances that it wasn't a case of me trying to manipulate her. It was literally a case of, I've just discovered this and I need to share it with someone. Apart from that, I let her come to me with her questions and with her doubts. And I think that approach reaped dividends.
So to summarize that, it was It was almost a question that you allowed her to be in control of the process. So
Yes.
you made it known that you were kind of available as a resource if she wanted to ask questions, but you weren't, with the occasional exception of like you said, that almost Kaiser Soze moment of the UN, which is completely understandable. You kind
Mm.
of let her do it at her own pace, come to you, ask the question. So she was kind of in control of that process in a way. It was never a question of her having information forced on her.
And when you think about it, that's how it works when you do wake up from Jehovah's Witnesses. You wake up because you're in control. If it felt as though someone else were in control, or someone else were making these decisions for you, then you would, human nature would be to recoil and to think, no, this is, I don't like this. So I've pretty much kind of learned from my own feelings from waking up and how terrifying it was for me, and tried to apply that as much as possible to Deanna, and I think that worked quite well.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's probably worth pointing out is, as you said, you've resigned to yourself to the fact that this might have been the end of the relationship.
Yeah.
Thankfully it wasn't, but I think it's important to kind of, for people in this situation, to understand that their spouse has choices too, and it may be that their spouse doesn't want to leave the religion. Maybe their spouse won't wake up. So it's important to approach this hoping for the best, but being kind of understanding that the spouse has a choice as well, and you can't force anybody to wake up. And it's that kind of thing, that you're only responsible for your own decisions. You can't control the life of other people. And as we've said, thankfully, in many cases, spouses do wake up and people are able to leave with their family. But obviously, we know that's not always the case. And there are witnesses who do, suffer the breakup of a relationship, which is very tragic. But if you're in that situation, it's important to remind yourself, well, you can't control the decision that the other person makes. All you can do is be there for them, offer them information if they want that information, and then the rest of the choice is down to them. You can't beat yourself up too much over what they decide.
Yeah.
But thankfully, you were able to wake Diana up, and you both left together. Obviously, I know your father, as you say in your book, your father didn't leave, and you are one of the many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who perhaps has contact with. You have some of your family, your wife and your little girl, but you don't have other members of your family. So you're in a very similar situation to many witnesses who leave without their friends or without large numbers of their family. Now, how did you manage to then rebuild that aspect of your life? So when you leave as a Jehovah's Witness, all of your friends go away, all of your contacts go away. How did you start rebuilding your social circle or reaching out for kind of new friends to talk to?
Well, there's kind of an irony there, because I'm not really in a normal situation where I live, because I'm in a country where I don't speak the language, or at least I don't speak the language fluently. So straight away, it's difficult for me to kind of integrate with my sort of local community. I do sort of integrate in that I occasionally play football with the local guys. So to the extent possible, I try to kind of be sociable with people in my community. And I think if you were in a country where you did speak the local language, if you were a native, for want of a better word, of that country, one thing I recommend in my book is, well, you can go to kind of local community centres and join clubs and join a walking club and this kind of thing. That isn't really available to me. But what's strange is that by taking the position of becoming an outspoken activist against Jehovah's Witnesses, that led to me being shunned by family members, including my dad. But it also simultaneously led to the creation of a new community of friends, because if I'm going to be completely honest, almost everyone who I am close to because of my activism. So I know you because of my activism. I know, the rest of the team at JW Survey. I know Javier, who I'm working on the documentary film with. All of these people I've met because they became aware of me because of my activism. So in a strange way, I've made more friends now through taking that step, but I don't expect that to be the experience of everyone, because of course not everyone who leaves Jehovah's Witnesses is either inclined or in a position to become an activist and be an activist who people know personally.
Yeah. So I think the interesting thing there is that, I mean, as you said, it's all kind of, everyone takes a different route, but the key is kind of getting involved in some activities. So for you, it was activism and also football. But I think that one of the things, if you're in that situation as a freshly left Jehovah's Witness and you think everyone's abandoned you, it can be tempting to turn inward and to just kind of not get involved in things. But really the key to rebuilding your friendship, to rebuilding your life is taking that effort to go out and expand your interests and get involved in activities.
And another thing that I think it's important is to be, when it comes to non-Jehovah's Witnesses who you're trying to establish friendships with, is not to kind of expect them to be sympathetic to your situation, or be remotely interested in your background as a witness, because it just doesn't come to everyone to be that way inclined. I mean, religion is a massively taboo subject. Where some people, I think it's especially true of the British culture. You have this kind of I don't really want to talk about that, you know. And so I don't hold it against people, and that's one thing that you kind of encounter when you start talking to people as an ex-witness who don't know anything about the religion. You find yourself almost evangelizing a little bit about your experience, and you're looking at the expression on the person's face, and their eyes just kind of glaze over, and you think, oh crumbs, they are just not interested at all, are they? So, but that's unfortunately to be expected.
Yeah. And I've had similar experiences where I've realized, for me now, the key is, if it comes up in conversation, I give a very brief answer. Sometimes the answer is, I used to be religious, or I was raised in a religious family, but I'm not anymore. And then you kind of, like a similar thing, you just let someone ask questions, and you'll find that usually once they've got enough information, they'll stop asking. And sometimes I've met a few people who are fascinated and they keep me talking for hours, and other people, they're fine with a very quick, okay, I used to be religious, but I'm not now. And then, because that's not, because the friendship isn't based around that aspect of your personality, it's more based around who you are now. And in many ways that's actually quite refreshing, especially as you spend more and more time away from the Jehovah's Witnesses, and you start to find people whose friendship with you is based upon you as a person and not some shared or past religious experience. It's actually quite liberating.
And just talking about religion doesn't do it justice, really, because you know, when most people think of religion, they think of going to church on a Sunday, don't they? But the whole issue with Jehovah's Witnesses is it's kind of like an alien world that we grew up in, that bears no relation at all to reality. And I can't imagine, I mean, whenever you try and explain something unlikely or outrageous to someone, they always kind of in the back of their minds are thinking, he's making this up, you know. And so that's another challenge that you have, is that the experience that we had is so crazy, and the things that we were led to believe and do are so completely alien to what is normal, that's another challenge that you do encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking on things that are crazy, or, you know, harmful or not good, one of the things that Watchtower and obviously other high control groups such as Scientology or very fundamentalist strains of Islam or Christianity kind of tend to impose on people is an ethical code which is flawed. But if somebody's lived their entire life, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, we've spent possibly decades outsourcing our moral code to somebody else's idea of morality. And once we finally leave this religion, we're kind of standing there blinking in the sunlight thinking, okay, I don't believe the doctrines anymore, but I had this entire system of ethics which was placed on me. Now, how do I go about, you know, where do I go from here? Do I jettison the whole thing? Do I pick and choose? How do I go about reconstructing my idea of what's right and what's wrong and what's ethical? How did you approach that challenge once you'd left the Jehovah's Witnesses? And would you say there are any major differences in your ethics as a Jehovah's Witness to your ethics after you've left?
Well, I sincerely hope there are differences because when I was a Jehovah's Witness, I thought it was ethical to break up families over differences of opinion, I thought it was ethical to persuade someone to die rather than accept a blood transfusion. If pushed, I would have said it would have been ethical under certain circumstances to cover up child abuse. And I also thought it was ethical that the 7 billion people should die because they're not Jehovah's Witnesses. I find those ideas completely grotesque now. So that's one of the great ironies is that when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're taught that apostates are these debauched, immoral people. And you, actually, when you become an apostate, in most cases, your morals become better tuned in a way. But in my own case, I mean, when it came to belief and that kind of thing, I kind of prevaricated a little bit as a Christian on waking up, and the Christianity gave way to agnosticism, and the agnosticism gave way to agnostic atheism. But in terms of my ethics, I call myself a humanist because I believe in critical thinking. I believe in doing things that have the well-being of humans in mind to the extent possible. And I find that serves me very well as a moral compass.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's the journey I think a lot of people will go on, and obviously people will come to slightly. This is the thing; it's a mistake to expect everybody to leave a high control group and then for them to all adopt completely identical ethics. So you'll get a spectrum of people across various political or ideological or ethical concepts because everyone kind of finds their own path, which they think makes sense to them. I think the important thing, I don't know if you agree with this, is the important thing is not necessarily that. The important thing is that you find your own path through your own research and your own thought. You mentioned critical thinking, and I think that's the key. Is not because you spent so long as a Jehovah's Witness just accepted what's being given to you. The important thing is when you are kind of realizing for yourself, okay, what do I think? What do I believe ethically or ideologically or politically? Is to challenge every belief that comes in, analyze it from both sides. Is, what are the pros, what are the cons, what's the best argument for this position? Okay, now what's the best argument against this position? And almost kind of have that continual open mind, because the reality is that the JW ethical code is very black and white. And I've personally found, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, that the real world is actually, sometimes there's black and white and sometimes there's gray, and sometimes there's, I actually see both sides of this, and I kind of get why people disagree, because I kind of agree 60% with you but 60% with the other guy, and this is complex. Do you think it's almost a question of almost when you leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, you're required to grow up in a way? You're required to become mature when it comes to these decisions? Definitely,
because when you are a Jehovah's Witness, everything is black and white. A classic example, which I'm constantly having to encounter when I do the JW broadcasting rebuttals on my YouTube channel, is this false dichotomy of, well, if you are not a lover of Jehovah, in other words, if you're not a Jehovah's Witness, you're a lover of riches, you're materialistic and wealthy. And, that's quite clearly ludicrous, but when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you just think, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. Why wouldn't you be obsessed with money if you weren't serving Jehovah? So everything in the JW world is black and white, but I agree that when you leave that behind, you do kind of have to mature and think, well, not everything is black and white. There are shades of grey. And there are issues where there is no easy answer. And so it's worthwhile just taking some time to listen to both sides of the argument and reach conclusions based on that.
Yeah. It's kind of like to jump on a little bit onto another question about family situations, because I know you've got a little girl, Jessica.
Yeah.
Who I've met, and is an incredibly cute little kid, by the way. So congratulations.
She's got more of a mother than a father. That's fine.
I didn't want to say anything. But the interesting situation you're probably going to be in moving forward into the future is, obviously she's very young now, but as she gets older, she is going to start asking questions about obviously some of the family shunning that's going on. and some other issues that are related to the fact that your family's left a high control group. Do you have any thoughts or advice as to how you're going to handle that situation, and maybe advice you could give to other parents who are thinking, how do I explain to my little boy or my little girl that maybe their uncles or their aunties or their grandma won't talk to us anymore?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, Jessica, we've just celebrated her 4th birthday. And just celebrating birthdays alone is a magical thing when you're doing it, especially with your child. I mean, speaking for me personally, I can't get that excited about my own birthday, but I do get excited about Jessica's birthday. But I was really proud in a way that we've made it to her 4th birthday without her knowing anything at all about religion. If I was to say Jesus to her or God to her, there would just be this blank expression on her face. She wouldn't know what I was talking about. I'm not expecting it to be the case that we get to her 5th birthday and she's still quite that naive. But I'm glad we've at least got her through the first 4 years. I guess when the conversation comes up, there are kind of ways that you can explain things to a child where they will understand it. And one brilliant word that I like that children immediately understand because they have such a brilliant imagination is pretend. And so, for example, Jessica's grandparents on Deanna's side, she sees them quite regularly. And even though they're Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's quite complicated as to why they are in my life and my wife's life, but my dad isn't. But nevertheless, it still has an impact on Deanna's parents, and that will become increasingly noticeable to Jessica as she gets older. So I think it will just be a case of saying, well, Grandma has a pretend friend called Jehovah, and Grandma thinks that Jehovah wants her to do this, but really Jehovah isn't real. But don't say that to Grandma because it will upset her. So I think that there are kind of ways of approaching it in a way that a child would understand. When it comes to my dad, I'd probably approach things in a similar way. But the thing is, because he's shunning the family, he hasn't met Jessica yet. So she literally has no idea who he is. And even though we've periodically kind of shown him her picture and said, this is Lloyd's daddy. If I show her a picture of my dad, as I did a couple of weeks back, and say, who's this? Jessica will say, I don't know. Or there'll be this blank expression on her face and she'll wonder what I'm doing. So I'm not expecting too many questions too soon. I suspect by the time she's old enough to start asking questions about him, she will also be old enough to understand things at a slightly more complicated level. Yeah.
So it's that kind of really tailoring the explanations to the level of age that she's at. No, I like that idea of where, especially when you said, you sort of explained that Grandma has a pretend friend who wants her to do this, but don't say this to Grandma because she'll be upset. That's actually quite nice because it lets Jessica understand what's going on, but also lets Jessica understand, I don't want to upset Grandma, and it's a nice way of just handling the situation for now. Yeah, that's nice. So one thing I wanted to come on to, because obviously you've been very successful in your activism. You've reached a huge number of people. You've got a YouTube channel, I think, is it 25,000 subscribers?
It's now 26.
26. Okay, we've gone up an extra 1,000.
Yeah.
You've got the JW Survey website. You've had numerous media appearances where you've been interviewed on the BBC amongst other places about issues pertaining to the Jehovah's Witness religion. So if somebody is, because obviously the first thing is some people leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, have no interest in being an activist, and that's absolutely fine, because the main thing about leaving the religion is you now want to start living your life the way you want to do it. And if you're not interested in activism, then you shouldn't feel that you're obligated to do it. The point is you now have to go live the life you want. But some people do leave and they think, I actually want to do something about this. I can see the problems, and my personal journey, I think, is going to take me towards, in some way, trying to address these issues. So what advice would you have for somebody who's wants to get involved in activism, maybe is just getting started? What kind of general guidelines as a kind of a do's and don'ts would you recommend to somebody based on your experience of activism?
I think first of all, you need to want to do it for the right reasons. If it's just about getting subscribers and just about getting views, that will very soon show in the content. Another piece of advice that I have is to try as much as possible not to be too self-indulgent when I'm on the camera. And you do occasionally see YouTubers who don't bother editing their videos and leave in a whole load of stuff that's really not necessary, or just them goofing around. And I try to put myself in the shoes of the person watching and think, if I was watching this video, what would I want? How quickly would I want the information, and what would be the best way of getting this information across? So those are the two main things, really, is having the right reasons to do it, and also not taking anything for granted, and don't be boring and don't be self-indulgent. But I think with my own channel, I was thinking about this not so long ago, and it's really been a very, very long journey. I can imagine if someone's only just recently started watching the videos, they kind of imagine this kind of rocket ride, skyrocketing figures, and it's just grown overnight. It really hasn't. I set the channel up back in 2012, and back then I was still undercover, so I couldn't show my face on camera. And I kind of really set the channel up more so that I could play recordings of governing body members speaking, like Tony Morris, for example, because this was before JW Broadcasting, and no one really knew who the governing body members were. They were out of sight, out of mind, which I think made them more credible. And I wanted to change that. I wanted to show people who the governing body members were. So I created a series called Getting to Know, and then I would have the governing body member's name, and I would show clips of the talks. And then I can remember one day, this was actually still in 2012, it was after the Candace Conti victory. This was a massive story where there'd been, Watchtower had been defeated in a court of law on the mishandling of child abuse. And I can remember my good friend and mentor, John Hoyle, saying to me, you know what, Lloyd, there aren't really any videos on YouTube about the Candace Conti lawsuit. Why don't you make one? So I thought, I kind of treated that like a challenge, So I went away and I wrote a script, and the script ended up being for a video called The Candace Conti Verdict Explained: Why the Watchtower Has Been Punished Over Child Abuse. And it wasn't a very long video, and I had a friend narrate it for me because it couldn't be my voice, otherwise it would be recognized. And I just put some imagery to it and that kind of thing. And that was kind of the first of the videos that were more than just me playing, clips of governing body members. It was me giving my opinion. and it wasn't until sort of November of 2013, by which point I decided that I was going to leave the organisation, that I started putting my face on camera, because I was like, to hell with it, I don't care.
Yeah.
But it really even then it was a very gradual rise. So 2013 was when I started vlogging. It wasn't until mid 2015 that I got past 5,000 subscribers. It was mid 2016 when I got past 10,000 subscribers. And it was early this year that I got past 20,000 subscribers. So it's been a very gradual thing, and there's been a lot of work and time and emotion and late nights that have gone into it. It really isn't just a case of, I think I'll make a video and this channel's just exploded. It really hasn't happened that way.
Yeah. So that's the key takeaways from that really are probably, if you're an activist, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Think about your audience. I mean, how would you like to have this presented, and what kind of, perhaps would you say, if the activists watch the videos they enjoy and try and work out, okay, why do I enjoy this? What appeals to me about this?
Yeah.
And then kind of have it in mind that it's a long haul. It's going to be it's going to be the kind of thing you don't want to burn out on. Because I know when I first started activism, I was like, oh, I'm going to write all these articles and do all this stuff, and I'm going to do all this stuff every week. And I suddenly, after a little while, I was like, I have to slow down a little bit, or I'm going to burn out. And so I think that would be one thing I'd say to anyone who's considering it is if you're gonna start, that's fantastic, but try and pace yourself a little bit, because you'll have all this enthusiasm at the beginning, and you need to make sure you don't run out of energy too soon.
I have this theory that activism has like a 2-year burn on it, and that's just from my experience, because I've been doing this now for 6 or 7 years now, and it just strikes me that people kind of burst onto the scene and they make loads of videos, or they write loads of blog articles, usually over like a 1 or 2 year period, and then they completely vanish. And some kind of like yourself stay the course, but it's to stay the course, you need a number of factors to come together. You need to really have the fire in your belly. You need to have things going well for you behind the scenes. So you need to have your friends around you. You need to have your family around you supporting what you're doing. And it's just that all of those stars aren't going to align for every single one.
And I think also for some people, activism's like a long-term goal, and I think for others it fulfills it's a very useful short-term thing that allows them to process what's happened to themselves, and it allows them to also give something back for the next generation who are leaving, and then they kind of feel like, it's time for me to try other things in life, which is also equally valid. But as you say, there seems to be that kind of churn of people who arrive and people who leave, and that's all fine. But if you're going to make it like a long-term goal, as you say, you need to have those factors in place behind the scenes. You need support behind the scenes. You need pacing, and you need to really have that desire for you to want to spend that amount of time focused on this.
Yeah.
So coming toward the end of the podcast, I've just got a couple of other questions I'd like to ask, which we tend to ask all the guests. So what aspect of your former group, in this case Jehovah's Witnesses, actually proved useful once you'd left? So was there any training or mindsets or attitudes which the witnesses kind of gave you, which once you left you thought, well, actually I'm going to get rid of 99% of this stuff, but this one thing, hey Watchtower, thanks very much, I'll take that, that's rather useful?
I can think of 3 things. First of all, public speaking. And again, this is one of the great ironies about Jehovah's Witnesses is that the thing that taught me to be a reasonable public speaker, or at least gave me that training, no longer exists, which is the Theocratic Ministry School. So, I couldn't have that back if I wanted it, because it's no longer there. But I'm grateful for the fact that I got that training in. It was probably the only transferable skill I received as a Jehovah's Witness. The other thing I'm grateful for is just learning about Jehovah's Witnesses, because for most people, for the vast majority of people, learning about the ins and outs of Jehovah's Witness doctrine in all of its kind of tedious monotony is going to be deeply, deeply, deeply meaningless. There's no actual use for it. But I've got, as you know, a massive collection of Watchtower books, and I think of it as something that's nicer to look at than it is valuable. It's essentially just a wall of nonsense. But I'm glad that, for me personally, that I learned it all, and I'm particularly glad that I was able to go through ministerial training school, because it just so happened in my particular case that I was then able to then turn around and use all of that information against Watchtower, because I knew it. So in my own case, it's worked out well that I learned a lot about the religion. And the third thing related to my MTS is speed reading. Because when I went to MTS, they were saying, oh, you need to learn how to speed read. And I was like, what on earth do you mean speed reading? There's only one speed I know of when I'm reading, and that's just reading. And they said, no, it's when you can kind of scan through a page and get the gist of what it's talking about. And I didn't believe that you could do it, but I've actually learned how to do it. And that's coming useful, for example, when we've had court documents that I've needed to kind of read, and transcripts and what have you. And I wouldn't even call it reading. It's just being able to kind of scan the page, looking for certain words, so that I know roughly what paragraph's talking about what. And that's something I picked up at MTS. So.
Cool, because that's something we always kind of on the podcast we encourage people to do, is that the first instinct when you leave this group is to say, oh, what do I do now? They've taken all this stuff from me, and they probably have, but have a look at what you may have gained from them, because now you can use those skills for yourself. You can use those skills to build your own career up, to start building your own life, and that's the key of kind of, so rather than focus on what they've taken, although that might be painful, try and focus on what you've been able to glean and build up, and how you can start using those skills for your own purposes now, and to build up your own life. So related to that, what was one of the hardest cult habits to overcome? So of all the things the Jehovah's Witnesses taught you that was harmful or toxic, what's the hardest to overcome, and how did you overcome it?
I think the hardest part, which any apostate goes through, is the stigma of reading apostate information. It was, for reasons that we all know, it's like climbing a mountain. It's a really difficult barrier to push through, because you have your whole life been taught that apostates get their information from Satan, and it's all lies, and it's very, very cleverly designed to mislead you and manipulate you. And just pushing through that barrier, I think, out of everything, was the most difficult. And also just being able to laugh at the leaders, I think, because I can remember when I first started making my YouTube videos. I've mentioned the Getting to Know You videos. I was basically mocking the governing body members. And because Deanna was slightly behind me and waking up, I can remember her saying, "Oh, Lloyd, you have to do that. They're the governing body. You can't make jokes about them, you know." And that is how you feel as a Jehovah's Witness. That these are sacred men, and whatever you do, you can't laugh at them. But just learning to, because if there's one thing cults just cannot handle, it's being laughed at. Yeah. And I think that just learning to do that and giving yourself permission to do that takes away a lot of power from the cult.
Okay. So lastly enough, if you had one piece of advice you could give to those who've just left, so not necessarily just Jehovah's Witnesses, but anyone who's left a high control group or a cult, or as sometimes when we discuss in this, someone who's left like a really toxic, controlling relationship, and they're finding themselves now in the sunlight, they're free of this control, they're free to be the person they want to be, and they're thinking, okay, what do I do now? What would be one piece of advice you think would be useful for them to have in mind?
It's difficult to boil it down to one piece of advice, but if I absolutely had to choose one and only one, it would be to do research, because I think that too many people leave groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and they just shrug it off and say, well, I just know it's not true. I just know it's a cult, and I don't need to invest many hours of studying to know that that's the case. But then what you're left with are all these kind of inner conflicts, because even though your conscious mind knows that it's not true, your unconscious mind, and I'm no expert on psychology, but I know that these hang-ups stay with you if they are not successfully purged. And the way to purge them is through briefing yourself on exactly how you were lied to, so that when the hang-ups and the doubts and the insecurities and the flashbacks come calling, you've got like a repository of factual information that you can counter it with.
Cool. Thank you. So the last thing we always do on these podcasts is ask our guest if they have one awesome thing they would like to recommend to our listeners who are perhaps stepping out of a high control group and into a world where they're free to think and explore and do and experience. So is there one thing you think people should really check out that you found useful or entertaining or just plain fun?
I don't know. I guess travel. Just see as much of the planet as you possibly can, because it's a big old planet and our time on it is limited. We're never going to, it's just impossible to see all of it. But at least during our moments in the sun, if we can see as much of it as possible. I know they have the cliche that travel expands your mind, but I really do believe that. I think that you need to kind of understand that there are different places from where you grew up, and there are different ways of thinking and different cultures and that kind of thing. It really does alter your perception and make you more open-minded and tolerant and kind, I think. So lots of travel.
Cool. Thank you. So the thing I'm going to recommend is a podcast I've been listening to called History on Fire, and it's by a historian and lecturer called Daniele Bolelli. And you can find that podcast on iTunes, but it's this really interesting series because he's this Italian guy. He's got this fantastic Italian accent, but he's a history lecturer. And he has this ability to take you through all the podcasts about different periods in history. So I've just been listening to one which is all about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And he takes you through the events and the culture that led up to that battle, you know, and the famous Custer's Last Stand, and the aftermath and the impact it had on the Lakota people. And it's absolutely fascinating because he takes these kind of these instances in human history and really takes you inside the experience of what people were feeling at the time, why people were feeling the way they did. He helps you realize what it was like to be one of the Lakota Indians who was literally facing the end of their way of life and the gradual shrinking of their territory, and then takes you into like what it was like to be one of Custer's men on the Little Bighorn as you slowly start to realize that you're being surrounded, you're being overwhelmed, that everybody is going to die. And it's this really interesting way of, it's kind of related to what you were saying about travel, of sort of stepping into other human experiences and expanding your mind. And I think that's an excellent podcast. If people are looking for a gripping history podcast, I'd really recommend History on Fire, which is available on iTunes.
There are a few simple pleasures in life that beat learning something that's interesting for the first time. I was watching a documentary on Nikola Tesla recently, and it just had a nice way of explaining how an AC motor works, because that was sort of his thing, the thing he invented. At a time when direct current was the only form of electricity, the big challenge was, well, how do you make a motor run on alternating current? And it just explained it in a way that I could personally understand for the first time. And just those moments where you're like, oh, I've actually learned something there. A really enriching experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Lloyd, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you online, and what projects are you working on?
I'm embarrassingly difficult to avoid online, so you can find me on Twitter, I guess. Cedars JW Survey. You can find me on YouTube on the John Cedars channel. I occasionally pop up on jwsurvey.org. And on Amazon, my book is The Reluctant Apostate, and the other one, the more recent one, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses.
Cool. Lloyd Evans, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, thank you for listening to the ForwardCast. If you've enjoyed this podcast or found it useful, there are many ways you can support it. You can subscribe on iTunes to get access to new podcasts as soon as they go up, and to easily access our back catalogue. You can share this podcast with your friends and family on social media, and you can follow me on Twitter at Covert Fade. If you'd like to support us financially, you can do so on Patreon/Covert Fade. And thanks so much to everyone who's already donated. Your generous support continues to make this podcast possible and to help us to meet the expenses involved in creating it. Remember, you just get one life, so work out the kind of life you want to live, make a plan, put that plan into action, and start living it now.